The plains had a way of swallowing sound. You could shout into the wind and hear nothing but silence in return. That was how Elijah Crow liked it. A man of few words, fewer friends, and more land than he knew what to do with. After losing his parents to fever and his younger brother to a stampede 6 years back, Elijah stopped counting what he didn't have. He focused on what remained. 1,000 acres of dry grass, a weather-beaten cabin, and a horse named Rusty, too old to run but too loyal to leave. People in town called him the Quiet One. He didn't go in often, just enough to buy salt, tobacco, nails, and flour. He kept to himself. Never drank with the boys, never danced with the girls, never looked up when laughter passed him by. And folks, they noticed. When a man's lonely long enough, people stop wondering how he got that way and start making jokes about why. So when a group of ranch hands from a rival spread decided to pull a cruel prank, they didn't expect it to backfire. They brought him a wagon. In it, wrapped in rough blankets, was a young woman, paralyzed, mute, eyes wide, watching, and a note scrawled sloppy on the back of a whiskey label. "You said you wanted company. Here's one that won't walk out." Elijah stared at the woman for a long time, not at her legs, not at the note, just her eyes. Then, without a word, he tore the paper in two, lifted her gently into his arms, and carried her inside. He didn't return the wagon, didn't ask who she was, didn't demand answers. He just built a ramp the next day, widened the cabin doorway, and started making her oatmeal each morning. Because he knew what it was like to be left behind, and he wasn't about to leave someone else. The woman didn't speak, couldn't walk, but she watched him closely, quietly, like she was waiting to see if he was real. Elijah didn't press. He simply spoke aloud as he fed the chickens, patched the roof, or sat by the fire whittling. "Storm's coming in from the north. Rusty's limping again. You like apples in your porridge or no?" He never got answers, but she blinked once when he asked the last one, and that was enough. He didn't know her name. He didn't ask. Because sometimes you have to earn the right to hear someone's story. And Elijah Crow had all the time in the world. Elijah never expected a response. Each day he spoke to the woman like the prairie wind, soft, steady, not needing anything in return. He told her about the cattle, the weather, the creaking of the front porch that only complained during sunsets. She sat in the same wooden rocker by the window, a quilt over her lap, her spine supported with careful padding he'd shaped from old saddle blankets. She never made a sound, but she listened. That much he knew. A week passed, then another. Elijah learned her rhythms. She blinked twice when she wanted water. Once she blinked and almost smiled when he added cinnamon to her breakfast. And when he lit the fire too late one night and she shivered, he never made that mistake again. She didn't speak, but she taught him how to listen. One evening, while brushing Rusty down, Elijah heard a rustling from inside the cabin. Not the wind, not a mouse. He rushed in, heart thumping, and found her on the floor. Her wheelchair had tilted when she tried to reach a shawl. She wasn't hurt, but her eyes were wide, embarrassed maybe, or afraid. Elijah knelt beside her, gently scooped her up, and placed her back in the chair. Still, she wouldn't meet his gaze. So he said without fanfare, "You've got grit, miss. Ain't shameful to need a hand now and then." She blinked, then ever so slightly nodded. That night he didn't sleep. He sat near the fire, carving a new handle for her chair, and thinking about the way she'd looked up at him. She wasn't just surviving. She was trying to move, trying to reach, trying to live inside a world that had long since decided she couldn't. And that made her braver than any man he'd ever known. The next morning he set the new handle in place. Didn't say a word, just nodded when she touched it with her fingertips and blinked twice. "A thank you." He smiled, a rare thing. "Name's Elijah," he said simply. "If you ever feel like telling me yours, I'll be here." She stared at him for a long while, then blinked, once, then again, and then, ever so faintly, her lips moved. No sound came, but he saw it, the shape of a name. Clara, Clara. He repeated it under his breath all day. Not aloud, not yet. Like if he said it too loud, it might vanish. But he carved it in his mind like initials on old barn wood. Clara, a name he didn't expect to earn, a gift given in silence. He started addressing her by it softly. "Clara, you sleep all right? Clara, sky's turning yellow, storm's coming. Clara, there's stew if you're hungry." She blinked more now. Once for yes, twice for no. She even started humming. Quiet, broken sounds that didn't form tunes but reminded him there was something alive in her still. Sometimes he'd catch her smiling, just barely. Other times tears welled in her eyes when she tried too hard to lift something and failed, but he never pitied her. He just adjusted the shelf, moved the basin closer, waited, and slowly Clara began to fill the space. She liked sitting outside near the chicken coop, a blanket across her lap. He wheeled her there every morning after breakfast and left her with a book or sometimes a pot of water and flower bulbs he wasn't sure would bloom. And one day, when he came back, he found she'd managed to plant every single one with her trembling fingers. Not a word, not a sound, just dirt under her nails and defiance in her eyes. Elijah crouched beside her and looked at the row. Crooked, uneven, perfect. You know, he said, brushing soil from her palms. Most folks would have waited for help. Clara met his gaze, then slowly shrugged. Elijah laughed. It startled them both. From that day on, he started talking less, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. Clara had her own pace, her own language. And he realized something. He hadn't been lonely because no one was around. He'd been lonely because no one had seen him. Now someone did, and he saw her too. One quiet evening, as they sat on the porch and watched the wind chase light through the grass, Clara tapped his hand with her fingers. He turned. She mouthed something again, carefully, deliberately. Thank you. No sound, but the words landed like thunder. Elijah swallowed hard, then tipped his hat. You're welcome, Clara. The storm rolled in without warning. Not the soft kind that whispered through tall grass, but the sort that shouted through broken skies, cracked branches, and turned dust into thick mud. Elijah had just finished boarding the last window when he heard the creak from Clara's room. Lightning flashed. He found her gripping the side of the bed with her weak fingers, face pale, jaw tight. Her chair had tipped again. Not because she had fallen, but because she had tried to stand. She wasn't ready, not even close. Her legs were too frail, her muscles too thin, but something in her had ignited, a flicker that refused to stay dim, no matter the odds. Elijah crouched beside her gently. You don't have to rush it, he said. Clara blinked once, and with effort, she raised one hand to his chest, right over his heart. Her touch was soft, cold, but it made him feel warmer than any fire. The storm howled through the night. They sat by the hearth, Clara bundled in quilts, Elijah fixing a leak in the roof between thunderclaps. When he returned, soaked to the bone, she looked at him with that quiet fury, the kind of worry people reserve for those they care about. And that's when it hit him. She wasn't just a guest, not a burden, not a shadow someone dumped on his doorstep. She was his home now, as much as the land or the horse or the sky. The next morning, the storm had passed. The plains were glassy with dew, and the sunrise painted the clouds in apricot and gold. Elijah wheeled Clara outside. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. She stared at the horizon for a long time, longer than usual. Then she raised a finger and pointed at a nearby fence post. A bird sat there, tiny, singing. Clara's lips parted. Just a breath, just a note. But Elijah heard it, the first sound from her mouth. Small, cracked, but real. They didn't talk about it. They didn't need to. Because that sound, that was hope, finding its voice. The bird didn't stay long, but its song lingered in Clara's memory and in Elijah's heart. For days afterward, he caught her humming under her breath, barely a whisper, but full of intent. But she was changing, healing, not just in body, but in spirit. And so was he. Elijah started building more than fences. He carved handles into every wall inside the cabin. He constructed a raised garden box so Clara could plant herbs without needing help. And in the evenings, he'd read aloud, his voice slow, steady, while Clara followed along with her finger on the page. One night, she stopped him. Her hand hovered over the book. Then she pointed at a word, light. Her lips formed the syllables slowly, painfully, but clearly. He stared, heart thudding. Do it again, he said softly. She tried. Light, she rasped, hoarse, cracked, and Elijah dropped the book. Not from surprise, but from joy. They celebrated with coffee and molasses biscuits, sitting outside where the air smelled of pine and distant rain. Clara leaned into his shoulder, her head resting against his arm. She didn't have to say more. That one word had said it all. She wasn't lost anymore. As summer arrived, something else changed too. Elijah no longer looked away when Clara stared too long. He didn't avoid her touch, her eyes, her questions made from silence. Instead, he found himself drawn to her like moonlight to still water. Gentle, quiet, inevitable. Then came the letter. A rider from town delivered it, wrapped in twine and dust. It was from her family. Elijah didn't open it. He handed it to Clara. She didn't move for a long time, just stared at the envelope, the handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it. There were only a few lines, but tears fell down her cheeks before she finished reading. Elijah stepped forward. What does it say? She met his eyes, lips trembling. Then she mouthed, They thought I died. The wind picked up. The plains whispered. Elijah knelt beside her. You don't have to go back, he said. Not unless you want to. She looked down, then slowly reached for his hand. Held it! For the first time, her fingers were thin, fragile, but they gripped his with certainty. I'm already home, she whispered. Elijah didn't move, didn't speak. Clara's hand in his felt like sunrise, unexpected, warm, and powerful in its quiet simplicity. The woman who once arrived in silence and shadows was now claiming her place, not just in his cabin, but in his life. They didn't talk about what the letter meant. Not yet. Instead, they slipped back into their rhythm. Only now there was something new between them. Something unspoken but unmistakable. Connection. That summer, the ranch changed. Clara insisted on helping with chores, planting onions, feeding the chickens, polishing tack, even folding laundry. Elijah adapted tools, rigged pulleys, invented ways for her to be part of every task. She laughed, really laughed, the first time he accidentally spilled water on his boots while trying to install a hand pump. He grinned. Ain't easy, but worth it. She mouthed, You're terrible at plumbing. He raised an eyebrow. You just now figured that out? That night, Clara sat beside him under a sky bursting with stars. She tapped his arm, then her chest. Then she pointed to the stars. He understood. She hadn't seen them in years. Not like this. No noise, no ceiling, just open sky. It's different out here, he said. The quiet's got a voice of its own. She nodded, then reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of his coat sleeve. Tell me about before, she whispered. Her voice was stronger now, though still soft. Elijah hesitated. He rarely spoke of the past, but tonight he owed her the truth. I lost my brother when I was 20. He was trampled by our own cattle in a thunderstorm. He looked down. After that, I stopped needing much, or anyone. Clara's hand squeezed his. But you didn't stop hoping. He met her eyes. No, I just forgot what hope looked like. Until you. The fire cracked softly between them. The wind settled, and for a long time they sat in silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they finally understood everything. By late summer, Clara had learned to move from her chair to the porch bench on her own. She still needed help for many things, but she'd grown stronger, inside and out. And Elijah? He no longer saw her as the woman who arrived broken. Now he saw her as the woman who built something new from the ruins. One morning he found her outside before dawn. She had wheeled herself out and sat facing the pasture, shawl over her shoulders, curls blown loose by the wind. Couldn't sleep? He asked. She shook her head, then whispered, They want me to visit. He didn't need to ask who they were. The family? Clara nodded. He sat beside her, quiet for a moment. Then softly, You thinking of going? She looked down at her hands, scarred, strong, hers, then back toward the cabin. I don't know who I am to them anymore, she said. But I know who I am here. That day, Elijah brought her to town for the first time. People stared, of course. It was a small place, and strangers drew whispers like moths to lanterns. But Clara didn't shrink. She held her head high, her chin steady. Elijah walked beside her like he always had. Not as a caretaker, not as a savior, as an equal, as hers. At the mercantile, the owner's wife gasped. Is that Clara Hensley? Lord, we thought you were dead. Elijah tensed. But Clara simply smiled and said, Not dead, just found. They returned home that afternoon, their wagon filled with dry goods and glances neither of them commented on. That night, Clara wheeled up beside Elijah as he repaired a saddle strap. Would you ever think of leaving this place? She asked. He looked up. Not unless you asked me to. Her voice wavered. And if I didn't, then I'll stay. She paused, then whispered, Then this is home, for good. A week later, Elijah returned from the fields to find something different. Clara was in the barn, directing Rusty's brushing with a teenage neighbor girl who'd come to help. The girl was laughing. Clara was smiling. And for the first time, Elijah saw her not as someone surviving, but someone belonging. The joke those men played on him, that cruel wagon delivery under moonlight, it had become a story folks stopped telling. Because now Clara wasn't just part of the ranch. She was the heart of it, the pride of the plains. Autumn rolled in with gold-stained trees and the smell of burning wood in the air. The ranch thrived. So did Clara. She moved with ease through her days now. Not walking, no, but gliding through routines she had mastered. The kitchen was hers in the mornings, the garden in the afternoon. Elijah built her a writing desk, and most evenings she'd sit and compose short letters to townsfolk who had started sending her kind words and gifts. It was like the land had adopted her, as if the open plains had claimed her in the same way Elijah had. Steadily, wordlessly, completely. One chilly evening, Elijah brought out an old guitar. He hadn't played since his brother died, but Clara was sitting by the hearth, humming that same wordless tune she'd favored all season. He strummed once, then again, and when he looked up, Clara was smiling. Keep going, she mouthed. So he played old cowboy songs, lullabies, even a clumsy melody he made up on the spot, just for her. Her fingers tapped along on the arm of her chair like she was conducting a silent orchestra. Afterward, he set the guitar down. She wheeled closer, then reached out, deliberately, and rested her palm on his knee. "I've never had a home like this," she whispered. "Not even before." Elijah leaned forward, looking into her eyes, steady as the moon above them. "You're not just part of it, Clara," he said. "You're what makes it home." That night, she didn't return to her room. Instead, she asked him, softly, almost afraid, if she could sit by the fire longer. With him. So he brought a second quilt, and side by side they sat as the logs popped and the wind crept beneath the doors. She fell asleep with her head on his shoulder. And Elijah? He didn't move an inch, because for the first time in his life he felt whole. The first snow came early. By dawn, the cabin was wrapped in white, the fence posts wearing soft hats of frost. Clara watched the snowfall from her window, steam rising from her cup of tea. The land looked quiet, blanketed, like it was waiting for something. That morning, Elijah found her holding a familiar envelope, the letter from her family, the one she'd tucked away months ago. Unanswered. He didn't say anything, just waited. Finally, Clara looked up. "I think I should write them back." She spent the afternoon by the fire, her pen slow but steady. Every now and then, she paused, like she was rewriting more than just a message, like she was rewriting the truth of who she'd become. By sunset, the letter was sealed. "I don't need to go back," she told Elijah, "but I think they need to know I'm all right, that I'm not lost anymore." He nodded, setting his hand over hers. "I'll take it to town myself tomorrow." The next day, the wind cut sharp as a blade, but Elijah wrote anyway, her letter in the inner pocket of his coat close to his heart. He thought about how far she'd come, how far he'd come too. He'd once believed nothing good ever stayed. Not people, not peace, not love. But Clara was still here. She'd weathered more storms than most men, carried more silence than some could bear, and still she smiled. When he returned that evening, she was waiting on the porch, wrapped in wool and twilight. "How was town?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "Mail's on its way," he said, climbing down from the saddle. "And I brought back something extra." He handed her a small package. Inside was a bundle of new yarn in her favorite dusty blue, and a folded handkerchief embroidered with a wildflower. She blinked hard. "You remembered?" "I remember everything about you," he said. "Even the things you think I miss." She reached for his face then, her palm to his jaw, and for the first time he leaned in. There was no hesitation, no fear. Just two people, healed and whole, meeting halfway under a falling sky, and when their lips met, it wasn't passion that burned, it was peace. Snow deepened across the plains, but inside the cabin, warmth never left. Elijah added logs to the fire while Clara rolled yarn between her palms. She was making something, a surprise, she said, but every time he tried to peek, she'd shoot him a playful glare that somehow melted him more than the hearth ever could. Their lives had fallen into rhythm, soft mornings with shared coffee, midday chores done side by side, evenings spent near the fire, fingers brushing now and then until neither of them pulled away. They were no longer simply coexisting. They were becoming a life together. One morning, as frost rimmed the windows and the ranch lay quiet under a curtain of white, Clara wheeled out of her room with a small bundle in her lap. She stopped in front of Elijah, heart racing like she'd faced down a stampede. "This is for you," she said, lifting the cloth. Inside was a scarf, hand-knitted with careful, uneven stitches, the dusty blue yarn he'd brought from town. Embroidered at the corner, imperfect but deliberate, was a single name, Home. Elijah blinked, stunned silent. "You made this?" he asked. She nodded. "And that word?" "It's what you gave me," she said. "Before I could walk, before I could speak again. You gave me a place where I could be, without shame or fear." He stepped closer. "You gave me more than a scarf, Clara." She tilted her head. "You gave me back to myself." Outside, the wind howled low and cold, but inside, the man who once lived alone and the woman once left in silence now stood wrapped in warmth they built together, not because the world allowed it, but because they chose it every day. Later that night, Elijah lit the last lantern. Clara watched him from her chair, and then softly, "Elijah?" "Yeah? I don't feel broken anymore." He turned, his gaze gentle. "Sure. That's because you never were." The heart of winter arrived with silver skies and the hush of snowflakes blanketing the earth. Clara spent more time near the window now, watching life pass in soft silence. Cattle moving in slow herds, smoke curling up from the chimney, Elijah chopping firewood in steady rhythm. She no longer dreamed of escape. She no longer feared being seen. She was rooted, like the land. One quiet evening, Elijah came in with red cheeks and snow in his beard. She chuckled, pointing at his face. "You're part snowman." He grinned, brushing off the frost. Then you must be the fire that keeps me meltin', her blush answered for her. They spent that night reading side by side, Clara mouthing the words softly, her lips forming the syllables like a kind of dance. Every few pages, Elijah would pause and ask, "Want me to take over?" But she shook her head, determined. This was hers, her voice, her mind, her reclaiming. When she finished the final page, Elijah leaned over and kissed her temple. "You're braver than anyone I've ever met," he whispered. Clara smiled. "And stop acting like I'm fragile." He nodded, serious now. "You're not. You're fire-wrapped in grace." The next morning, a letter arrived. It was from her youngest sister. Short, gentle. An invitation. To visit in spring. No demands, no guilt. Just a hope to see her again. Clara folded the letter slowly. "I think I'll write back," she said, "but not about going. Not yet." Elijah nodded. "Your pace, your call." Outside, the wind swept across the hills, stirring old snow and whispered things the land never forgot. Elijah took Clara's hand and helped her onto the porch, both wrapped in wool. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "why life waited so long to give us this?" He looked at her, not the chair, not the past, her. "Because it was waiting until we were ready," he said. "And now, we are." By the time the first buds appeared on the trees and the snow retreated into memory, Clara had changed. Not just in strength or in voice, but in the way she held herself. Shoulders no longer drawn inward, eyes no longer scanning for escape. She didn't just survive the winter. She bloomed from it. Elijah noticed the way she wheeled herself across the yard without pause now, her hands calloused, her sleeves rolled up. The hens followed her like she was one of their own. Even Rusty, the old chestnut mare, dipped her head each time Clara passed. "She's your girl now," Elijah teased one morning. Clara smirked. "She just likes my apples better." But deep down she knew it wasn't about apples. It was trust, the kind you earned through patience, kindness, and showing up. That week, Elijah finally cleared the trail that led to the ridge overlooking the entire valley. He came in at dusk, dirt on his shirt and excitement in his voice. "You ever want to see forever?" he asked. "I think I found it." The next morning, with a makeshift harness he built and a wheelbarrow-like cart adapted for rougher terrain, he helped her up that hill. It took time, but they reached the top. And when Clara looked out over the golden grasslands, the winding river, the distant cabins tucked under the mountains, she gasped. "This is what freedom looks like," she whispered. Elijah sat beside her, legs outstretched, his hat tipped back. "No, darling," he said gently. "You are what freedom looks like." They stayed there until the sky turned lavender. And when Clara turned her head and saw the sun lighting Elijah's face, etched with years, lined with loss, but so full of quiet hope, she whispered the words she'd never dared say aloud. "I love you." He didn't move for a heartbeat. Then two. Then he smiled. "You beat me to it." The days grew longer, the air warmer, the soil softer under Clara's fingertips. She'd taken to planting things, flowers first, then herbs, on the little strip of land behind the cabin. Elijah built her a raised bed she could reach from her chair, and every morning she visited it like it was a sacred altar. "Never thought I'd be a gardener," she said one afternoon. Elijah looked up from mending a fence post. "You've been planting things here since the day you arrived." She turned, tilting her head. He smiled. "Peace, kindness, belonging, me." Spring brought more than new growth. It brought clarity. One evening, Elijah knelt beside Clara as she worked in the soil, brushing away weeds. "I was thinking," he began, voice rougher than usual, "maybe this ain't just your home. Maybe it could be your name, too." She blinked. "What do you mean?" He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a silver ring. Simple, quiet, shaped like the horizon. "I don't need promises or parades, just you, just here, always." Clara stared, her breath caught. "Are you asking me?" "I'm not asking you to be mine," he said gently. "I'm asking to be yours." She didn't cry. Instead, she whispered the same two words that had saved her the day he first opened that wagon door. "Yes, please." The wedding wasn't grand. Just them, the land, a preacher from town, and a few folks from the valley. Clara wore cream. Elijah wore his cleanest shirt and nervous hands. They stood under the old sycamore tree while birdsong filled the sky. When the preacher asked for vows, Elijah turned to Clara and spoke plain. "You changed what I thought a life could be. You gave me back something I didn't even know I lost. And every morning I wake up beside you will be the best thing I ever do." Then it was Clara's turn. She didn't speak long, just looked into his eyes and said, "You didn't rescue me, you saw me, and that saved me more than anything else ever could." They sealed it with a kiss that wasn't fire or thunder. It was sunlight, steady, warm, eternal. Married life didn't change everything. It didn't need to. There were still fences to mend, livestock to feed, seeds to sow. The wind still howled some nights, and the stove still sputtered when you lit it too fast. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. Not in the structure, in the feeling. It was no longer Elijah's home with Clara in it. It was theirs. They made changes slowly. A second handrail by the stairs. A lower cupboard Clara could reach. He even rebuilt the porch ramp when she mentioned the old one rattled under her wheels. She never had to ask twice. And when she tried to help with chores she couldn't quite manage, Elijah never stepped in to stop her. He just stood nearby, patient, letting her learn where her limits ended and her courage began. One Sunday afternoon they painted the kitchen together, cream and soft green. Clara had picked the colors. Elijah got more paint on himself than the walls, and Clara laughed so hard she almost fell from her chair. It was the kind of laughter that healed years. Later they ate supper on the porch, sunset bleeding across the sky. "I never imagined this," Clara murmured. Elijah looked at her profile, softened by the gold of dusk. "This?" "This peace," she said. "This stillness, not having to prove I'm worth anything." "You never had to prove that," he said. "You just had to come home." That night, Clara lit a single candle and placed it on the windowsill. "For all the girls still in the dark," she whispered. Elijah wrapped an arm around her. "They'll find their light, just like you did." The next morning she received a letter from her sister again, this time with a photo enclosed. The little nieces she'd never met. Clara stared at the picture for a long time, not with sadness, but something deeper. "Hope! I might visit them one day," she told Elijah. "You'll know when it's time," he said. She nodded, then slipped the photo into the frame beside their wedding picture. Not every story needs to go back to the beginning. Some stories begin when you finally feel safe enough to grow. The summer came quiet and slow, like a hymn hummed low over golden fields. The ranch moved with its usual rhythm. Elijah in the barn at sunrise, Clara in the garden by mid-morning, the two of them meeting on the porch for lunch, always making time for each other, even in silence. But one evening the silence was broken. It started with a fiddle. One of the ranch hands, young Will, barely 20, brought it along during a weekend visit from town. After supper he tuned it and began to play under the sycamore tree. The sound was raw, tender, a little off-key. Elijah watched Clara, who had gone utterly still. Then, as if moved by some old part of herself, she closed her eyes and began tapping her fingers against her lap. Slow at first, then sure. "I used to dance," she said softly. He nodded, standing. "Would you like to again?" She blinked up at him. "Elijah, I can't." "You can?" He didn't lift her from her chair. He didn't carry her. Instead, he stepped behind her, placed his hands on her shoulders, and began to sway with her gently, side to side, in time with the fiddle. It wasn't a dance of bodies. It was a dance of souls. Clara's eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She smiled. "I never thought I'd feel this again," she whispered. "You don't need legs to feel music," Elijah replied. "You just need someone who hears it with you." The other ranch hands watched in respectful silence. The stars above burned a little brighter that night, and when the last note faded, Elijah knelt beside her. "You move me," he said, in ways I didn't think were still possible. Later, as they sat by the fire, Clara whispered, "There are girls like me out there, forgotten, dismissed, discarded. I want to tell them what's possible." Elijah looked at her, something proud and tender blooming in his chest. "Then let's find a way," he said. "Let's show them." It wasn't just a vow between lovers anymore. It was a promise to the world that every person, no matter how broken they were once told they were, deserved to dance, even if there wasn't any music. By early fall, word had spread, not by intention but by quiet example. A neighbor's wife came by one morning with her daughter, a shy girl in leg braces. She'd heard about Clara, the woman in the valley who didn't let a chair keep her from growing roses or dancing beneath sycamore trees. Clara invited them for tea, and without realizing it, a new chapter began. She started holding small gatherings on the porch, just once a month at first. Women from nearby ranches, a few war widows, a girl with a crooked spine who rarely smiled until Clara taught her how to crochet. No sermons, no lectures, just warmth and space, and stories shared in the kind of silence that listens. Elijah watched it happen, quietly proud. He built benches, repaired the fence near the back meadow so the children could play. And whenever Clara spoke in that soft, certain way of hers, he stood behind her, not in front, not beside, but as her shelter. "I think I want to write a book," Clara confessed one evening. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "A book?" "Something real," she said. "Not pity, not tragedy, just truth. What it means to start again." He reached across the table, took her hand. I'd read every word. That fall, the first frost came early. The garden withered, but Clara didn't mind. She'd already harvested what mattered. One night, as the wind whistled softly beyond the cabin, Clara found an old box of Elijah's tucked in the closet, filled with leather scraps, unfinished carvings and a journal she'd never seen. She brought it to him. He hesitated before opening it. "I started it after the fire," he said. "Didn't know what to do with the things I couldn't say." Clara sat beside him as he flipped through the pages, sketches of his old ranch, his parents, a house half burned, and later, her, drawn with care, always beneath the sycamore tree. "You kept me even before I was yours," she whispered. He closed the journal. "You were never anyone else's to begin with." That night they lit the lanterns early. Not because it was dark, but because some lights are worth tending before night ever falls. The days grew shorter. Leaves turned amber and drifted across the porch like whispers of old seasons passing through. Clara found herself pausing more often, mid-task, mid-sentence, mid-thought, just to feel the moment, because these weren't just days anymore. They were proof she had lived past what tried to break her. One morning a letter arrived. Different this time. It was from a publisher in Denver. Clara had sent a few chapters of her writing, never expecting a response. But there it was. Interest, curiosity, a tentative yes. "They want to publish it," she told Elijah, eyes wide, voice shaking. He set down his coffee slowly. "Of course they do," he said. "Truth has a way of finding its way out of silence." That weekend they rode to town, together, not because they needed anything, but because Clara wanted to be seen. Not as a shadow of someone else's tragedy, but as a woman whose roots had grown so deep they could hold up storms. And people did see her. The shopkeeper tipped his hat. The butcher's wife handed her a bouquet. Even the mayor's daughter stopped to ask softly if Clara would ever speak to the church ladies about her journey. Clara laughed gently. "I'm still on it." Back at the ranch, Elijah hung a new sign over the gate. "Second Wind," it read. Clara stared, touched. "Why that name?" He glanced at her, soft smile in his eyes. "Because when most folks would have given up, you found your second wind, and brought me mine too." That evening, with dusk cooling the valley and coyotes howling far off in the hills, Clara read aloud from her draft. Elijah listened with his boots propped and a quiet fire crackling. "You think people will care?" she asked, closing the notebook. "I think the ones who need it will feel less alone," he said. "That's more than enough." They didn't need a crowd. They had a ranch, a porch, and a life made of small, quiet victories. The kind that outlasted dust and drought and time. By midwinter, the ranch had settled into the stillness only deep cold can bring. The river slowed to a whisper under thin sheets of ice. The horses stood quieter in their stalls. The wood stove became the true heart of the house, crackling steady as Elijah and Clara moved through their days like a practiced waltz. Simple, sure, and warm. One snowy morning, a knock came at the door. Not many people visited in winter. Elijah opened it to find a stranger. Young, nervous, eyes flicking between his boots and Clara's wheelchair just behind the doorway. "Are you Mrs. Clara Maddox?" the boy asked. "I am," she said gently. He swallowed, then reached into his coat and handed her a copy of a magazine. On the cover, her photo. Inside, an excerpt of her story titled "Still Standing." "I just wanted to say it helped," the boy murmured. "My sister, she's been struggling, but after reading your piece, she asked me to build her a garden box." Clara's eyes misted. Not because it was grand, because it was real. After he left, she sat with Elijah by the fire. "You ever think something you say might just travel?" she asked. He nodded slowly. The wind always remembers the names worth carrying. A week later, more letters came. From women, men, even children. Some had scars like hers. Some carried scars no one could see. All of them said the same thing. "You made me feel like I wasn't forgotten." That spring they hosted a gathering. Not just neighbors, but travelers. Distant ranchers. A woman from 3 counties over who arrived in a hand-built cart of her own. There were no speeches, just stories, and laughter, and shared silence that felt like healing. As twilight fell, Clara wheeled herself beneath the sycamore tree, now adorned with ribbons, paper stars, and wishes scribbled in quiet hands. Elijah joined her, slipping his fingers through hers. "This started with a joke," she whispered. He looked at her. "And now?" she smiled. "Now it's a legacy." The wind picked up, tugging at the tree branches like it was listening. And maybe, somewhere in that wild breeze, were the words of every person who thought they'd never be seen. Until someone like Clara reminded them they mattered. The ranch thrived through spring, not just in fields or fences, but in souls. People came and went like the changing seasons. Some stayed for tea, others for days. Clara and Elijah welcomed each as if they'd always belonged. It wasn't a sanctuary because of walls or prayers. It was a home because healing lived there. One day, Clara received a letter from her sister. Not just words this time, an invitation. "Come visit," it read. The girls want to meet the aunt who planted flowers in their hearts before ever seeing their faces. Clara held the letter in trembling hands. I think it's time, she said to Elijah. He didn't ask if she was ready. He simply asked, would you like me to go with you? The journey wasn't easy, but neither had the road that brought her here. And when she stepped off that train, with Elijah at her side and her wheels bumping along the wooden platform, Clara felt something she hadn't in years, closure, and a beginning. Her nieces ran to her like they'd known her forever. Clara laughed, wept, and held them with arms that had once thought they'd never be enough. Her sister stood behind them, quiet but open. I should have protected you better, she whispered. Clara nodded, no bitterness in her face. You're doing it now. They spent a week in the little house by the river, talking late into the night, making up for lost time in the way only women with shared scars can. When Clara and Elijah returned to the ranch, it wasn't with sadness. It was with lightness, the kind that comes when burdens are finally set down. That summer, Clara started writing again, not just her story, but others. Stories that deserved space. Stories that had waited too long in silence. Elijah built her a desk by the front window, sunlight always within reach. One evening, as they watched fireflies drift across the yard, Clara turned to him. Do you ever wonder what people will remember about us? Elijah didn't hesitate. That we planted more than we took and left the door open behind us. Because some legacies don't come with monuments. They come with open hands, open hearts, and a porch light always left on. Autumn came again, her favorite season, not because of the color in the trees, though it dazzled every ridge and valley. Not because of the golden air or the taste of apples Elijah sliced just right, but because autumn knew what it meant to let go and still be beautiful. The book was finished. Still Standing had gone from whispers on a page to something bound and real, sitting in libraries and kitchens and hospitals and schoolrooms. Letters poured in from every kind of person. Farm wives, nurses, war veterans, teenagers learning to move through a world not built for them. Each letter began the same. I thought I was alone. And each time Clara read it aloud. Because no one was anymore. They were older now. Elijah's steps slower. Clara's hands not as steady. But none of it frightened them. Not the creaks in their bones or the gray in their hair. Because they had already won. They had loved past the odds. One evening, Clara sat on the porch beneath the sky turning violet. She looked over the fields, the barn, the sycamore tree now draped in ribbons faded by sun and time. Beside her, Elijah held her hand. His touch never wavered. If tomorrow never came, she whispered, I'd still be full. He turned to her, eyes soft. You are tomorrow, Clara. When the first snow fell that winter, the whole valley went silent. But inside the cabin, there was music, not from a fiddle or a radio, but from the sound of pages turning, laughter shared, a fire crackling steady, and the warmth between two people who had once been discarded by the world, but who had built a life no one could take from them. On the ranch gate, the sign still hung, Second Wind, because that's what they gave each other. And that's what they gave the world. A second chance, a second breath, a love not rushed or loud but lasting. And long after both their names had faded from letters and covers and town records, the porch light still burned. For anyone still out there, rolling, walking, crawling toward hope.